Welcome to lesson 2 of Crim 120, where we will talk about punishment and why we punish people, what we hope to get from that, and then we'll also go into a brief history of types of punishment, which of course you also will get a lot of history from the SkyPack module, which really is very helpful and should supplement this material quite well. But first, true or false? Crime in the United States has continued to increase over the last decade, despite our best efforts to control it. Is that true or false? False. Remember, crime has gone down for many decades. It has been going down for pretty much as long as you've been alive, and as long as I've been alive, crime's been going down. Okay, so again, before we get going, I want you to stop and think about, why do we punish people who break the rules? What do we hope to get out of that? What's the point? And so write down 3 reasons why we punish people. And then I want you to think about, of those 3 reasons, which to you is the most important reason, and give a brief explanation of your answer. All right, well, hopefully you guys came up with something along these lines. You might not have used the words deterrence, but you might have said to make an example out of somebody so that they don't do it again, something like that. And that actually is 2 different kinds of deterrence. General deterrence is where you're trying to generally deter others. You're not necessarily concerned with the individual who broke the rules. You're trying to make an example of that individual. So public hangings, for example. The point would be to try to scare other people who witness that public hanging to deter them. So that's one of the rationales for a lot of the public punishments, is that other people see that, right? They're locked in the stocks, people are throwing cabbages at them, and you say, wow, I don't want to be that person. So that's to deter others from committing the same offense. Specific deterrence is something like trying to stop the individual from ever wanting to do it again. So that might have been where you said, if you wrote something like to prevent them from doing it again, or you might have said to deter them from doing it again. And so that is specific. You don't really care if you're making an example, if it stops others from committing a crime or breaking the rules. You're really only concerned with that one individual. So disciplining your child might be an example of that. You're not really trying to, if you have a 3-year-old who breaks the rules, does something that she shouldn't be doing, you're not really concerned with trying to prevent other 3-year-olds from breaking the rules. You're only concerned with your single child. And so the response you make is really concerned with that specific deterrence. And we'll talk more about all these reasons. Rehabilitation, reintegration, they're kind of 2 different things. So ideally, we'd also punish offenders, and we try to punish them in a way that we can also rehabilitate them. And that is to try to get them, rather than deterrence, which you're really not committing offense again out of fear. Rehabilitation is you get your mind right so that you don't want to commit another offense. It doesn't occur to you. So you have a different thought pattern, a different behavior pattern, so that you're not committing offenses. And it's not so much out of extrinsic concern with punishments, but intrinsic motivation. And then reintegration is, you can rehabilitate someone, but if the community won't help them reintegrate back into the community, they still stand a very difficult chance of succeeding and not committing new offenses. So reintegration is, making somebody a contributing member of the community again, right? We want them to get jobs. We want them to pay taxes. We want them to be part of conventional society. So that's reintegration. So it's kind of a different thing. We also punish offenders just because we're really mad at them, or we think that you deserve to be to be punished. So retribution, sometimes people call it vengeance. The people who support Just Desserts prefer not to call it that. They prefer to see it as, well, you punish somebody because they deserve to be punished. And so you're not really concerned with whether or not you're rehabilitating people. You're not concerned with whether or not it makes an example. It's just that breaking the rules deserves punishment. And so you have to punish somebody because that's the only response to a violation of the social norms, of the social contract, of the rules. Incapacitation. So this is sort of like a form of specific deterrence where you are trying to take away that individual's capacity to commit new offenses. So it's like, well, maybe we can't rehabilitate you. Maybe we can't deter you from doing it in the future. But as long as we've locked you up or do engage in some other form of incapacitation, you can't commit a crime during this time. And that actually in the 80s, during the big prison boom, that actually became the rationale for incarceration. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, the federal correctional system, and a lot of states had more or less given up on rehabilitation. And we'll talk about that later. But they basically said incapacitation. So that's where you get this idea of warehousing offenders. Well, maybe we can't rehabilitate them. Maybe we won't deter them from future activities. But for the 10 years they're in prison, they can't steal, rob, burgle, assault. They can't commit those kinds of crimes out in the free community. So incapacitation is just simply trying to prevent somebody from committing another offense. And selective incapacitation too is you're selectively incapacitating a small group of people. So we know small percentage of offenders are responsible for a large percentage of offenses. And so if you can identify those individuals, it's just more cost effective to focus on those individuals. And then finally, restoration. We have a whole lesson on restorative justice. And that's what this is. And restoration really is focused. You'll notice all these things on why we punish offenders, why we imprison offenders is based solely on the offender. Well, restoration also brings in the victim. So the offender is only half of the crime for crimes that aren't victimless. And we always focus on them. We rarely talk about the victims. We're always, whenever we talk about crime, it's always about the offender. But part of how we punish and how we resolve crimes and rule breaking from the restorative perspective is to try to make the victim whole again. It's really not about the offender. It's really about what helps make the victim complete. And we'll have a whole lesson on restorative justice. So getting back to deterrence, as I mentioned, general deterrence is the use of penalties to frighten or intimidate others who are not yet offenders. So you put somebody in the stocks, you know, and you make it very public. You put them on the chain gang where it's all very public. The idea is other people see this punishment. They don't want to suffer the same consequences. So they're scared away from committing new offenses. Specific deterrence is you're applying penalties to that specific offender to prevent them from committing any additional offenses. So you put them in prison, they spend 5 years in prison. The hope is they get out and they go, well, I don't want to go through that again. And so they then are specifically deterred. So you're either generally trying to deter a wide audience or you're specifically trying to deter that individual. And some punishments might serve both, but some punishments would only serve one or the other, right? So a very private punishment generally is not going to serve general deterrence. It's only going to serve specific deterrence. And Cesar Beccaria was an 18th century Enlightenment philosopher, and he wrote a lot about this, and it's really amazing how much of current corrections practice is based on Enlightenment. And it also speaks to how important a liberal arts education is, how important it is to study things like philosophy, because they can really give you great insight into, say, the criminal justice system. So anyway, he wrote, there are 3 important components to punishment for deterrence to work. The punishment has to be certain. So if I don't think I'm going to get caught, or I don't think I'm going to get punished, then whatever that punishment is, it's not going to deter me. So if I'm on probation and I'm not allowed to smoke pot, and the punishment is I'll go back to prison, well, if I don't think they're actually going to punish me, then I'm not going to worry about it, right? Or if I go, well, instead I'm going to snort coke, that's out of my system in 48 hours. I'm way more likely to pass a drug test if I snort coke or I take LSD. then again, I don't have this fear of that I'll actually be punished. So certainty is really important. Celerity or swiftness is the punishment has to come shortly after, like immediately after the offense. And so that's a real problem with criminal justice is a lot of our punishments happen quite a bit after, right? So you might get arrested immediately or shortly after, but then the actual punishment itself, you know, you get arraigned, you might be released on your own recognizance or on bail or something like that, but the actual punishment could come quite a bit later. And there's a lot of great evidence that swiftness is really, really important. And a lot of it comes from animal studies and psychology. So a lot of sociologists kind of are leery of this. They sort of poo-poo the importance of celerity, of swiftness. But I think it is super important, and a lot of the research bears it out. The problem is once you get into natural experiments in the field of criminal justice out there, you don't necessarily have a lot of examples of swiftness. But there were some studies, like in Hawaii, the HOPE program, and they've replicated it in some other programs, where they said, okay, anybody on probation or parole, anybody on community corrections, let's say, for whatever technical violation they make, we're just simply going to immediately put them in jail for 24 or 48 hours. So there is a certainty to it, and it's immediate. So if I go in, I test positive for drugs when I go in to meet my probation officer or my parole officer, that's it. As soon as it tests positive, they immediately take me, they put me in jail, and it happens immediately, and it happens certainly. There's no chance it's not going to happen. And what they have found is that greatly reduces recidivism. And what's important too there is that's not a severe punishment, right? 24 hours at jail, but its severity, the third component, is the one we all focus on. And it's the one politicians are always talking about, right? About how sentences should be longer and this and that. But it turns out severity actually is the least important of the three components. Because it doesn't matter how severe a punishment is, if you don't think you're going to get caught or you don't think you're going to be punished, the severity is irrelevant to you. And then with celerity or swiftness, it could be severe, but if it happens 3 months after I've committed the offense, then it's not going to have a deterrent effect, right? So if my daughter, broke some rule, say she spray painted on our sofa or something like that, and 3 months later, I smack her upside the head and send her to her room, that's not going to deter her from spray painting a couch again in the future. She won't be able to link those two things, right? Three months later. And so severity turns out, even regardless, he never really meant that it has to be a very, very severe punishment. For Beccaria and for most Enlightenment thinkers, it basically goes to proportionality. It has to be just severe enough so that when individuals are sort of calculating this cost-benefit analysis of, well, what's it worth for me to steal the CD from Walmart? How severe is the punishment? The costs just have to outweigh the benefits. But again, we focus so much on the severity part, and we do so little to focus on certainty that somebody will get caught. And we have really, really, really low clearance rates for things like burglary for just that reason. And then celerity. We don't really do a lot about swiftness. And so it's a shame. The two that are the most important, certainty seems to be the most important, according to the research, are the two we focus the least on in our political system. So as I said, certainly the research shows that certainty is the most important component of the three, and severity is the least important. And again, obviously, if you don't think you're going to get caught, if it's not certain there's going to be a punishment, all the severity in the world is irrelevant. But if it is for sure you're going to be caught, actually the punishments don't have to be very severe at all. All right, rehabilitation. That is to facilitate change in the offenders. So again, deterrence, you're not really trying to change the offender, you just don't want the offender to commit another offense. Rehabilitation is, you want that offender to not want to commit another offense. It's sort of the difference between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic. Extrinsic is there's this outside punishment that you will receive if you don't pull it together. Intrinsic is, well, I intrinsically don't want to, I won't feel good if I commit another offense. And that, of course, is think about when you think about rehabilitation, AA, NA, life skills programs, counseling. A lot of the more successful ones are cognitive behavioral therapy, anger management, conflict resolution are, to me, the biggest ones. So many of the problems that a lot of offenders get into is they just could not resolve a dispute very well. They could not handle conflict very well, and it becomes violent. So the rehabilitative ideal is a new thing, right? So historically, crime was, well, if you go back far enough, crime was sin. You had just gotten, you veered off the path from God. And so we'll talk more about that with the penitentiary. So you needed to get right with God. And then really crime became then from after that really more of sort of a moral issue where, well, you're doing a bad thing, right? You might be a bad person. And then you have the rehabilitative ideal, which is really focused on sort of, well, maybe you're a broken person and we can try to fix you. And you saw the growth of this in the United States in the early 1900s. At the same time, you saw the fields that professionally provided rehabilitation. This is really the growth of psychiatry, psychology, social work really started at the turn of the last century, early 1900s, and the medical field. And they thought rather than religion or rather than morality, that in fact there were these sort of personality or behavioral deficits or defects that explained why people committed crimes. And so it could be anything. It could be psychiatric problems, educational problems, vocational problems. And of course, which one it was depended on what field you were in. So if you were a psychiatrist, naturally you felt like, well, the problem is psychiatric defects. If you were a teacher, educational defects. If you were a trainer, then it was vocational problems. But basically, once you've identified these defects, you could correct them. You could fix those defects and you would fix the offender. So again, deterrence isn't concerned with that at all. Retribution isn't concerned with that. Retribution is, well, you're going to get punished because you deserve to be punished. Rehabilitation is, well, let's try to make the punishment so that we can fix these defects. And really what this is this a medical model? This is a medical view of deviance, of crime. So it's no longer a moral. You're not committing these crimes because you're bad. You're committing these crimes because you're sick or you're broken. And so if we can identify, and most of the early positivist criminology and along these lines was biological. If we can identify your biological problems or your psychological problems or your vocational problems, we can repair you, right? The disease model of addiction is the best example. And what's interesting about the disease model of addiction is, I believe it was the guy who started AA is actually the first guy to kind of use this as a metaphor. He's just, referring to it as a metaphor. He never meant for it to become a literal, people to perceive it as a literal disease. People do now, though. People talk about addiction as if it's a literal disease rather than a metaphor for thinking about it. So the problem with rehabilitation, and I'm sure you've all heard of C.S. Lewis, and he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but he also wrote a really great article where he was very critical of the rehabilitative ideal. And his concern was this, that you're obscuring issues of individual responsibility. That once you take it out of crime, out of morality, and you make it a medical issue or a rehabilitative issue, then you've eliminated individual responsibility. Because if I'm sick, I'm not responsible for what I did. If crime is no longer a moral issue, it's a medical issue, then it's not a question of responsibility, right? We don't hold people responsible for getting Parkinson's disease. And so the medical model for him was and for a lot of people was a real problem. On the flip side is when you eliminate morality, you also then risk eliminating the moral constraints on punishment as treatment. Once you say, well, we're not punishing you to hurt you. We're not doing this for retribution. We're not doing this for deterrence. We're doing this for your own good. There's no limits to what I can do to you for your own good. Because again, we don't consider the moral constraints of cutting off somebody's limb if it's gangrene and you have to cut it off to save their lives, because that's what you do. There's no real moral dimension to that. It's a medical dimension. What is most likely to save their life? And so if you flip that and you turn that as a way to approach human behavior and crime, it doesn't matter what you do because I'm not doing it to hurt you. I'm doing it to help you. And that's where you end up with electroshock therapy. That's where you end up with lobotomies. And you end up with all these like really crazy things that also grew right along with the rehabilitative model and the medicalization of deviance. That brings us to retribution. Retribution is not concerned at all with whether or not you deter other people from committing another offense, not at all concerned that you make the offender a better person, but rather you punish for the offense. You punish the individual because that offense deserves punishment. And it was, I think, best explained by Immanuel Kant, again, a philosopher. So if you don't know who Immanuel Kant is, you should take a good Western philosophy class. And he said, if you had this society that was on an island, and tomorrow everybody was leaving that island, and the society was breaking up, and it was never going to exist again, he said that society still has a moral obligation to punish every offender before they go, right? Which from a rehabilitative point, who cares? Or from a deterrence perspective, if you're not going to be a society tomorrow, it doesn't matter whether or not you're deterring generally or you're deterring specifically, right? There's no society tomorrow, so it doesn't matter. But for him, he says, yes, you do have to, society has a moral responsibility to punish because this offense happened, because there was a breach in the morality, because there was a breach in the social code. And so that is what has to be punished. You have a responsibility to punish because the offense deserves punishment. Completely different from deterrence and rehabilitation and all these others. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that's often sort of conflated with vengeance, that basically there's revenge, there's a revenge motive for this. And you can trace this back to Lex Talionis, an eye for an eye, although it's worth noting that Lex Talionis and a lot of the ancient laws that predate, this is right from Hammurabi's code, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But if you look at some of the legal codes that actually go earlier than that, they actually were all based on proportionality. So we tend to interpret this all as retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But in fact, that was actually sort of a fining system. At least that's what it became. And so it was the value of an eye for an eye, the value of a tooth for a tooth. And so it served two purposes. Primarily, the concern was to stop people from feuding. So if you come and you kill my kid, I get up some of my friends, I go over, I kill your kid, and I kill your wife. Well, I kill your kid and your wife, then you get up a bunch of friends, you come over, and now you kill my whole family. And it just goes back and forth. And that's what has, ancient, you really had that risk, like the Hatfields and the McCoys in the Appalachian Mountains, this famous feud like that. And so the idea of capping what you can sort of, the pound of flesh you can get, is to prevent feuds. So basically they're saying no more than an eye for an eye. So you can't take out, if I pluck your eye out, you can't take out my eye and chop off my arm. It's basically a limit. And again, that's not how we interpret this popularly. We always view it as like, yeah, an eye for an eye, like it's a revenge thing. But that really wasn't what it was. It was really a limit to prevent feuds. And it was also kind of a fining system. So you wouldn't literally have to lose your eye if you could afford to pay the value of an eye. And so if I killed one of your sheep, you wouldn't necessarily come over and kill my sheep. I had the option of paying whatever that sheep is worth. Or if I killed your daughter, there might be some price that I could pay for what a child was worth, rather than simply having my child killed. The question would be, if I didn't have that money, then yes, that would happen. So examples of retribution is the death penalty, say. You maybe execute somebody for murder because death is how you punish for that. Truth in sentencing laws, right? That's not concerned with necessarily deterrence, certainly not concerned with rehabilitation. It's, hey, that offense deserves this much time in prison. And truth in sentencing just means you don't get to get out early, it's sort of these mandatory minimum type things. And so that offense deserves this punishment. And then, adjudication, like waiving juveniles to adult courts, obviously not concerned with rehabilitation or even necessarily deterrence, but saying, hey, if you do an adult crime, you're going to do adult time. That's a focus on retribution. That's a focus on the offense. Incapacitation. This is removing the capacity or the ability of the offender to commit crime. And the idea is that simple. Well, maybe we can't deter you. Maybe we can't rehabilitate you. Maybe revenge is an unhealthy motive for punishing people. But if I can lock you up, you can't commit crimes while you're locked up. And that, again, that was sort of the rationale for incapacitation, for locking people up for quite some time now. There's a number of problems with incapacitation. One is that people point out is that, well, new offenders can replace voids left by old offenders. So if you go and you arrest somebody who's selling drugs on the corner and you put them in prison, well, there's a half a dozen other people ready to hop up on that street corner to start selling drugs. So that's a great example, but that doesn't hold for all crimes. It really depends on the crime type. There's not like if you put a rapist in prison, there's a bunch of other wannabe rapists now ready to take that individual's place, right? So you can, in fact, incarcerate your way out of a lot of violent crimes and those sorts of things, because there's not a ready population who's just like waiting for a certain amount of murder turf or assault turf to take over. There really is just a finite number of those individuals. Another thing is if an offender commits their offense in a group, you lock that person up, you've incapacitated them, but you're not doing anything to stop everybody else that was part of that group from continuing on, right? So you think about organized retail crime. Those are big groups stealing millions and millions and millions of dollars. So you lock up somebody to incapacitate them. That's not doing anything to stop that organized retail crime group. And incapacitation is based on predicting the future, right? Because retribution, I'm punishing you for what you did. That offense is why I'm punishing you. Incapacitation is, I'm taking away your capacity to commit future offenses. So I'm not really locking you up for what you did, right? That was sort of the event that led to me locking you up. But if I'm locking you up for incapacitation, I'm locking you up so you can't commit future offenses. Well, that assumes you're going to commit future offenses, so I need to incapacitate you. Well, there's a real problem with that, right? I'm now punishing you for things you may do in the future or may not do in the future. And this exists, like we do this. And this is what selective incapacitation is, right? And so selective incapacitation is, well, if you remember from my example from the halfway house, 11% of our residents were responsible for 70% of our disciplinary infractions. So you think, wow, if we could identify that 11% before they commit all those disciplinary infractions, we could eliminate disciplinary infractions, right? And so the argument for selective incapacitation is, well, look, we can't lock up everybody who commits an offense. It's just not feasible. Right? Just mass incarceration is not cost effective. We're finally starting to realize that. So selective incapacitation is just, well, how can we focus on that 11%? And if we can lock up that 11%, we can eliminate 70% of the problems. Right? So if we can do that, we can save the most money. The problems with this is, well, there's a number of them. And it's the same thing with predictive policing. So much of criminal justice now is becoming this Minority Report. If you've not seen the movie Minority Report, you should check it out. It's happening, right? We just don't have these weird twins floating around in a pool of goo making predictions, but instead we have algorithms doing the exact same thing. They exactly tell police where to go. This is the area where there's the most likelihood to be crime. So you should go police there. And the big criticism of that is, well, once you send the police there, they're obviously going to arrest people while they're there. So that then increases the odds that that spot will be identified as a hot spot in the future. And so it leads to this real bias in where people end up going, but it's hiding behind this sort of this guise of objectivity, because it's all based in statistics. Well, almost every decision throughout the process of corrections is based in the same sort of thing. So whether or not you can get bail or what your bail amount is to a large extent based on the predictions, the likelihood that you'll commit another offense while you're out, the likelihood that you'll try to escape while you're out, the likelihood that you won't come back to court while you're out. Again, these are all future things, but it's a current punishment based on what we think you might do in the future. So you may or may not go to jail based on whether or not we think you're going to commit a new offense. Well, we make all those decisions, and we make those decisions based on what your classification is for prison. We make those decisions based on how soon you can get out, right? So we used to use a classification instrument where I worked that, so for probation, they might use it to, well, if you get a high classification, that is, you have a high risk of committing a new offense, you got to stay in prison for another 10% of your sentence. You don't get to get out on parole. That's all based on the future. And the problem is you have false positives and false negatives. So these things are amazingly accurate, but they also miss quite a bit of the time. And so a false positive is, I think you're going to commit a crime, so I lock you up for an extended period, but you wouldn't have. And so now you've been unfairly locked up based on crimes you never would have committed. A false negative is the opposite. We don't think you're going to commit a crime, so we let you out and you do commit a new crime. That's also very terrible. And so real fairness issues come to, well, does it happen to where different groups have different accuracy levels? And so we know, for instance, that these things are not as accurate for women because women tend to have a lot of high needs. They tend to present a lot of the things like sketchy financial histories, bad employment records, education, etc. And then, so they end up with high scores, but they're actually considerably less likely to reoffend than men. And so they end up getting these very, being overclassified, right? False positives, such that every classification instrument has a separate scoring system for women. But without that separate scoring system, it would be completely unfair because the predictive accuracy is not the same for both genders. Well, we've also found that's the same thing for race, that urban minorities tend to be overclassified, or at least less accurately classified compared to whites. And again, part of the reason for that is they have a lot of the problems that are associated with criminogenic needs, like financial problems, educational and employment problems that correlate with crime, but they don't correlate 100% with crime. And so you have this lower level of predictive accuracy, you're now being less fair to somebody. And so that can be a real problem. On to the second half of this lecture, early punishment. We just talked about why we punish people. Now we'll talk about some ways in which historically people have been punished. But first, a sentencing goal that involves retaliation against a criminal perpetrator is called what? If you chose D, retribution, you were right. Removing the capacity or ability of the offender to commit crime is what? If you chose B, incapacitation, you are right. All right, a very little history. I already mentioned the Code of Hammurabi. This dates to around 1750 BC. And this is very famous, of course, because this is where we get this notion of an eye for an eye. And the reason why it's famous is because it's one of the few ancient codes where they actually have found most of it. But there were lots of other codes at the time and other civilizations and societies. And there also were a number that predated Hammurabi. And as I mentioned, the ones predating Hammurabi really were focused on proportionality. So in some ways, proportionality in Western history was the product of Enlightenment thinking. Bentham was very concerned with proportional punishments, but also these previous ancient laws and codes were also very concerned with that. And as I mentioned before, the major concern really was to avoid feuds. You're really trying to put a cap on punishment, trying to give punishment to the authority of the ruling, the king, or whatever the ruler was at the time, as opposed to feuds where it would be tribes and villages taking it upon themselves. So it's also part of the consolidation of power by a king. And this also happened in England around 1200, where the king started taking over the justice in the same way. So lex talionis is, of course, this law of retaliation, this sort of idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which again we tend to think of in terms of retribution, but also really was also kind of a fining system. And in fact, lots of laws prior to Hammurabi were fines, because the real focus, if you get prior to these big civilizations with a lot of social hierarchy and strong rulers, people were trying to keep the tribe together. They were trying to make sure they could restore balance. It wasn't about poking out eyes and drawing and quartering each other. It was really about keeping the tribe together and keeping peace. So a lot of punishment also is collective punishment, because crime is interesting in that it often holds civilizations and communities together, so that we come together because crime and deviance sort of defines what is not allowed, and in doing so it identifies what is allowed. By creating outgroups and practices we're not supposed to do, we emphasize who the in-group is and what the practices are. So collective punishment is, things like somebody's locked in stocks and you can go throw cabbages at them. Or, sometimes you see currently with countries with Sharia law, where maybe they'll go out and they'll stone someone to death. Several people can come together, the community can come together and all throw a rock at the individual. And those are collective punishments that are done as a community. And then feudalism, as we went out of, out of the Dark Ages and into the feudalist economic system, there was a lot less execution and an emphasis on fines and corporal punishment, or beatings, if you will. And that, of course, the reason for that is feudalism very much relied on the labor of the peasants, the serfs. And so if a peasant commits a crime and you kill him, you've just lost a unit of labor on your estate. So that's no good for you. And so instead, you might want to fine them or give them some whippings and then put them right back to work. And you'll notice this time and again is that the economic system is often very strongly tied to the mode of punishment, so that how punishment takes shape is often informed by the economic needs of the ruling class, usually. So another example of that is galley slaves. During a time of a lot of naval war, some European countries would sentence felons to row on ships, and they would basically die there. And what you would see is, as a country needed more and more galley slaves, they would just start arresting more people and convicting more people and sentencing them to have to row on these galley ships. Again, the punishment very much reflected the economic needs of the ruling class. So physical punishments. So there used to be a lot more physical punishment than what we have today. This is the Russian knot. It's sort of a tough little bugger with a handle there and a leather strap. And then you can see this little ring here. And then another singular leather strap for flogging or whipping. Branding, right? So this served two purposes. It was a painful physical punishment, but it also provided this extra sort of this idea of shame, so that somebody bore this mark. And then also so the community could identify who somebody was if they were a criminal. The ducking stool is interesting. They would strap people in, women oftentimes, and it would be on a long pole, and then they would duck you into like a really cold, icy pond. And then this, of course, is one of the most famous of devices, the cat o' nine tails. And this is a series of leather cords, sometimes with shells or rocks or metal balls tied in to add to the pain. And this was used for flogging. And the British Navy used it. It was used in prisons later on, but of course it was used prior to that as well. This is from colonial America, the gossip's bridle. So if you were convicted of gossiping, you would get, it's also called the brank. And it's this like a helmet of sorts with, you have this bar going across here, and then you have this metal bar that goes inside your mouth that makes it very painful to talk, sort of gouges your tongue if you try to talk. Again, you can see there's 2 points to this. It's both painful, but it's also very embarrassing. You notice all the people around. And so shame in these small communities, shame was very important method of social control. It wasn't just about punishing physically. It was also about embarrassing in front of the community, because it serves 2 purposes. When you think about general deterrence, these people don't want to be in that boat, but also these people are reminded of what's right and what's wrong. And then they can come together, and in coming together and collectively saying you're wrong, then they can collectively say, hey, we're right. And it really creates social cohesion, which is sort of an irony of crime, is that crime and deviance and breaking society's norms and rules actually can lead to stronger cohesion, such that some people like Durkheim and sociologists informed by him would argue that you have to have crime, you need to have crime, you have to have deviance in order to have social cohesion. And then, of course, you could be killed in any number of ways. And there was instant death, which beheading would be probably the best way to die. That would be the most instant. And that was often reserved for nobility. So you had to be rich to be instantly killed. Hanging could be instant, but as we'll talk about with the death penalty, oftentimes it is not instant. So in order to be killed through hanging, you really have to be dropped a long enough distance that it snaps your vertebrae and kills you instantly. Otherwise, hanging really is just strangulation, and it takes quite a while to hang there and die. And garroting is strangulation. So I don't know how instant those are, but if you are given the choice of being burned at the stake or strangled, strangling obviously is a much better, more instant way to die. So then you have those lingering deaths like being burned alive, which is of course a horrible way, and then breaking on the wheel, which is what this is a picture of, and that's where you are tied to a wheel, and that swarthy gentleman with the club basically breaks every single bone in your body, and you eventually die from that, and that is a horrible, horrible way to go. And later, you'd have also sort of these other forms of torture where you could use hot pincers to pull away the flesh, maybe pour molten lead into the wounds, drawing and quartering, gutting, all those kinds of things. And so this went on in really feudal Europe and places with strong monarchies. But it's important to remember that this wasn't always the case. And it's interesting to me that I think if you go back far enough, you actually go back to a more compassionate form of punishment. And then as you get strong centralized governments, you get into these more horrific means of public displays of really the power of the state. And then you have the Enlightenment, where people sort of rejected the horrors of torture and these spectacles, and really move towards what we have today, which is incarceration and that sort of thing. And as I talked about, humiliation is very important, and embarrassment is a very important component for colonial America and other small communities, because again, it's a way for people to come together and reestablish the norms by saying, hey, that guy is wrong. We all know the rest of us are right. And then to a much lesser extent, confinement. But confinement was not used as a punishment at all in the same way that it is today. And we'll talk later about the birth of the prison. So as feudalism fell apart and we saw the Industrial Revolution in England, you had a lot of people leaving the countryside and coming into these cities like London. And so you'd see this rapid population increase in a city, and they didn't necessarily have the jobs or the social control needed. And so you could see crime, especially property crimes, would really go up at this time. And so they didn't have prisons like we know them today. So one of the early imprisonment measures taken in the kind of starting in the mid to late 1700s and then going through sort of the early 1800s was using hulks. And these hulks were basically decommissioned naval ships that were no longer seaworthy, so they were moored, and then they would just sit there and prisoners would be held inside them. And so here you can see, you'll notice this is up on land, and you could lock up prisoners in there. And then here's how you can see over here a cross section. And so sometimes prisoners could drown because you might have a high tide come in. These things were not seaworthy, remember, so they don't necessarily float like they should. So if you were down here and there's a big storm and you have swelling waves coming in, you could drown. They were horrible. The conditions were terrible. They were no good. And what's interesting too is, if you know what chain shot is, you might have seen this from Pirates of the Caribbean. So if you're like a naval ship, you know, the idea is not necessarily to sink a naval ship that you're fighting against, but rather capture that ship, because ships are worth a lot of money, right? They're a heck of a resource. So if you can capture the ship, you're way better off than just simply sinking it. And so the best way to capture a ship is to take down its mast, and so it can no longer steer. Well, that's not an easy shot to make, so you use chain shot, which is these two cannonballs connected by this chain. You shoot it out of your cannon, and it's swirling around, and it gives you a much wider shot, kind of like using a shotgun to shoot a bird or something. And it can take down the mast. Well, so some people believe this actually then is where this idea of a ball and chain came from, because on the hulks, you would have chain shot maybe. And so it's just not a big leap then to, if you've got to keep them on the hulk, keep the prisoner on the hulk, you just simply cut that in half, connect one side to a person's ankle. And so chain shot might have been the forerunner to the ball and chain. Interesting. Around the same time, well, actually a little bit before hulks were used, Britain was transporting felons to America up until the American Revolution. So around 1610 up until 1776, Britain was sending war criminals and other criminals to America, right? We often think about Australia as the home of all these exiled felons, but in fact, America predated that. And then after the revolution, England was then shipping them down to Australia. And other countries did this as well, France, etc. And so here's this cool little, if we can get it. I'm gonna play this real quick. It's just really short, but it's really great. So that's pretty interesting. And down here too, this is a link to a museum in Australia where people can actually go and do their genetic research to see where their families might have come from, which is pretty interesting, right? So you can, sometimes it can be difficult to determine exactly when and where your convict ancestor arrived in Australia. And so it's to help people do their genealogies to find their convict ancestors, which I think is kind of interesting. So France also was doing this. France was transporting prisoners to Madagascar, which was a French colony, New Caledonia, the Marquesas Islands, French Guiana, and Devil's Island actually functioned as a prison until 1951. And that is, French Guiana is down here in the north side of South America. It's this little country. And if you ever want to go there, I believe you have to fly out of Paris. So you have to fly to France and then fly from Paris. But it's quite beautiful to go down there. And here is the Devil's Island over here. So here's French Guiana over here, and then there's Little Devil's Island right there. And then here's the Marquesas Islands, which, you know, look like a beautiful, wonderful place to do some time. But of course, it would be anything but if you were doing time in those places. And Russia, of course, as you most likely know, has continued to exile all kinds of prisoners to Siberia. And they did that up until the late 20th century, they were doing that. And then corrections in the US in the colonial time, really people were born sinners, and that was basically the view, that was the cause of crime. So as I mentioned, you sort of went through these 3 steps where crime was viewed as sin. Maybe the community failed to control the individual, and they got wrong with God, and so it was the product of sin. And then it became the product of morality, right? So that you were a bad person, you were doing bad things. And then of course we saw the medicalization, which is, well, no, you're a damaged person. And so that produces these actions. So as I said, the primary purpose of colonial era punishments was to shame and embarrass the offender. And maybe you read The Scarlet Letter in high school. That, of course, was about shame. It was so that other people would say, whoa, I don't want that, right? So it's general deterrence. I don't want that to happen to me. But also it's a way of establishing social cohesion. Everybody else, by eschewing that person and by condemning that person, then becomes part of the collective conscience. They say, yes, we're right. We are what society should be. And so actually by outcasting people and embarrassing and shaming others, it actually can make a community of in-group stronger. It's also can have really negative consequences, this idea of in-group and out-group. And of course, today, we're seeing this sort of tribalism writ large in the United States and in other countries. So as I mentioned, hot iron branding wasn't just painful, it was also embarrassing. So all those things, the brank, the ducking stool, those were all very much shameful punishments. But we stopped, right? You notice we don't really do this anymore. And so why is that? So I want you to think about shame as punishment. What is needed for shame to work as an effective punishment? Can you think of any contemporary examples of shaming? And do you think shame works? And what do you mean by that? Explain what you mean by that. So you can check out this article if you link to it by getting this PowerPoint. But some contemporary examples are, every now and then you'll see a judge will try to sentence somebody to have to wear one of those signs that says "I stole from this Target" or something like that. You know, Sheriff Joe in Phoenix felt that that was the point of, you know, he made the prisoners work on a chain gang and wear stripes. And every now and then you'll see a sheriff say, we're going back to wearing stripes. And the idea of having them on a chain gang working on the road with stripes is to embarrass them. And this, what's interesting is this article about, well, is it constitutional? Can we publicly shame? And so we're not going to go into it, but I think it's really interesting. So here it is. This woman she drove her SUV on a sidewalk to avoid stopping for a school bus, which is a horrible thing to do. And so her sentence was to stand on a street corner with a sign that says only an idiot would drive on the sidewalk to avoid a school bus. And so it's kind of an interesting article. It's really very critical of that. Right? I stole mail. This is my punishment. Right? So these are judges that tend to do this. It tends to be maybe judges that were elected, sheriffs that get elected, and so it's really an interesting thing. So for shaming to work, and it can work, but the offender has to feel capable of feeling shame. And so sociopaths don't feel that. Psychopaths, they're not going to feel shame. They just don't even feel that. It wouldn't even, like whatever you did, they wouldn't feel that shame. But also, and this is why we ended up getting away from it in colonial America, is that the community must mutually agree that certain behaviors are shameful. And so in a very small community, that works, because if you have a very small town where everybody's kind of the same and they all more or less agree on everything and they're all basically from the same religion, then they can all agree on what a shameful behavior is. But as more and more people move into an area and that community grows and gets larger and gets more heterogeneous and diverse, there's a lot less agreement on right and wrong. And so shame doesn't work if people don't all agree on that. There is no real shame, right? So if, say, somebody gets busted for smoking pot and you make them go and stand on a street corner that says, hey, I smoke pot, you could get a lot of high fives, right? As opposed to I stole mail, where we all kind of agree that's wrong. Not everybody agrees that smoking weed is bad, obviously. Plenty of states are legalizing it now and others have decriminalized it. And so if you don't agree on what's wrong, then shame doesn't work. And then oftentimes what can happen is that if you're trying to shame someone, they can actually become sort of a hero. They can become a martyr. If people tend to then sympathize with the individual who's being shamed publicly, and that's arguably one of the reasons why in the Enlightenment we moved away from public punishments altogether, because sometimes these people would go, everybody'd gather to watch somebody be punished, and then by the end of the punishment, they'd actually start to identify with that offender because the offender probably came from their social class and was being punished by the power of the state, and they actually would start to then view these individuals as martyrs, as more like them, and it could cause a lot of social unrest. So shaming can work, but you have to have a lot of things in place for it to work. Foremost, you have to have a community that agrees on a behavior as shameful or not shameful.